Hi, welcome to Monster Transmission. You're in Curt's Corner. We get a lot of questions on how to install Thor converters. Today we're specifically going to go over the AOD transmission. Now this will be the same procedure if you have an AODE, 470W, 475. Those transmissions, all the similar design and the same type of converter install onto the front of the transmission. So all of those converters on the Fords have mounting studs. Then there's the studs on the back of the converter right here, okay? They have 4 mounting lugs, okay? And the critical thing with these is the alignment. So a lot of these converters have, especially the AODs, have a drain plug. So what you want to do is when you install the converter, you want to rotate the converter around to where the stud with the drain plug is on the bottom, the very bottom. Okay, and that will make it easier for you when you're installing the transmission onto the engine that the converter is already lined up because you've rotated the flywheel around for the mounting holes on the flywheel. So this is the flywheel, typical Ford 5.0 liter, okay, and these enlarged holes are for the drain plug on the transmission, and the smaller holes next to it is for the studs of the converter. So this one has multiple, but some flywheels only have 1 or 2 elongated holes. So you have to ensure that you line them up at the bottom. So you have to rotate the engine around, rotate the flywheel around, and the flywheel stays on the engine. So you're not to remove it. But for demonstration purposes, we're going to show you after the converter is installed how the converter should fit and look sticking through the flywheel. So we're going to start by installing the converter. Again, we want to ensure that you're careful not to damage the seal because the seal has a metal spring on it. And that spring squeezes the seal down to squeeze this hub of the converter. So this area of the converter is where the front seal rides and the front pump bushing. So we put a little trans gel there to allow it to slide through. We've already added some transmission fluid. This converter will hold at least 2 quarts. And I would recommend installing the fluid prior to putting the converter on the transmission. You want to put at least 2 quarts in the converter first. There are 3 areas on the front of the transmission. You have the actual lockup input shaft. So you have the first shaft. Then you have the forward drum shaft with splines. And then you have the pump stator with splines. So you have 3 shafts on the AOD converter. On the 470, 475, those units, you only have 2 shafts. So in this AODs, you have 3. So they have to line up with all the splines in this converter. So as you put the converter in, you want to rotate it gently clockwise, applying pressure, pushing it in, and you'll feel it clunk. That's these splines lining up with the splines inside the converter. And the last clunk, the last part that goes in, is the actual flat land areas. You notice there's 2 flat land areas here on the converter. That lines up with the pump gears themselves. So the pump gear will slide right over this flat land area of the input hub. So that's the last part to go in. So we're going to put this converter in, and I'll show you how to measure it to ensure it's properly installed. It's installed on the first spline, and we're going to rotate it clockwise, applying pressure in. And as it goes in, you hear it clunk. There went past the first shaft, and now we're going to rotate it onto the pump gear. Okay, the converter's all the way installed, and we have the drain plug located at the bottom to line up with the flywheel. You can measure, if you can measure in there, the actual flat area of the converter to the front part of this bell housing. Should be about 1 inch to 1 1/4 inch. After this is all the way installed and you mount this up to the engine block, as you put the bell housing bolts in and you tighten them, you don't want to tighten one side completely and then try pulling the other side around. That will actually snap the bell housing. So the recommend you do is you start all the bolts and tighten them evenly. So tighten some on the passenger side and tighten the driver's side and pull it up. As you're pulling it up, the studs themselves should gradually be pulling themselves through the holes of the flywheel. If it is not, and the converter is not lined up or to the flywheel, and you start crushing it against the flywheel, okay, that's a bad situation. You need to have this thing lined up. So you have to loosen the bell housing bolts and turn either the flywheel or converter until it lines up properly to where the studs come through the flywheel. So this is critical on the Ford applications, that you line these studs up. Now after this is completely tight to the engine block, you should still be able to wiggle the converter, okay? You still have room to wiggle even though the holes are relatively tight. In other words, it's not wedged or jammed together, okay? Because you actually have to tighten the nuts, and as you tighten nuts, it'll actually pull the converter forward towards the engine, because when you installed the converter, it was all the way into the pump as far as it will go. That's not the operating position. The operating position of the converter is actually pulled out over 1/4 inch, if not more, towards the flex plate. And it's actually called a flex plate for a reason, because it flexes. Okay, as the engine runs, the converter, the flex plate will flex, and actually the converter can float in and out just a little bit. So we're now going to remove the converter from the transmission and show you how exactly the pump gear rides on the input hub of the converter. So I have a pump assembly here from an AOD, the actual pump stator. These splines line up right into the converter. So this is the pump gears on the AOD. Okay, we're going to take the center gear out. And you notice the 2 flat land areas. Those 2 flat land areas line up with the 2 flat land areas on the converter. Nice tight fit. There's no slop there. It fits tight. It's very easy that when you're installing this, especially on the ground, and you're trying to get this in, the converter can slide forward. And then when you go to tighten it up to the engine block, instead of the gears being lined up properly here, they can actually be on top. And as you tighten the bell housing up, you're crushing this input hub of the converter into this gear, okay? And you're crushing this assembly directly into the stator hub. And you're driving it into this assembly here. And if you happen to tighten everything up, start the vehicle up, you've just destroyed the pump assembly, the pump gear, and the torque converter. It's all been destroyed. And to know that you broke the pump gear or damaged them severely is that if you're able to put fluid in the transmission more than 2-3 quarts, the pump will not pump the fluid, starve the tranny for fluid, and then you're also going to fry the transmission trying to make it move. So to make sure that the converter, after it's installed on the transmission and you tighten it to the engine block, that you can still move the converter freely between the holes on the flywheel that's mounted on the engine. So that's how you install a converter on the AOD, and this is how it fits onto the pump. If you have any further questions, you give us a call here at Monster. Talk to anybody in our tech staff. We'd be more than glad to give you a hand with any of your projects. Call us at 1-800-708-0087. Talk to you then.